the first slide which you see doesn't mean it's Hercules cleaning, or Heracles in Greek cleaning the stables of Augeas. I simply have to disclaim this is not precisely the Commission for Health and Safety, nor its negotiating team, nor the presidency of the EU. And I'm also not alluding to the pharmaceutical industry. But there has to be some cleaning up, I'm pretty sure. My point, if I entered this slide, was that the interesting thing in the works of Heracles is that he is, of course, taking best efforts, but the king is concerned about results. And the problem is that's, of course, a famous distinction, at least since René de Moog in the French doctrine of private law, to distinguish between résultat et moyen. And it's an interesting distinction, which was more or less, de Moog thought it was a distinction coming from the natural law sphere, and it was more or less natural to think in these terms. My feeling is that he misunderstood something, and it was also remedied in the most recent private law codification of the Code Civil. You may know that in 2016, the Code Civil was changed, and I think they gave up that distinction between effort and result, because basically performance is about, that's at least the dogmatic point, performance is always about results, and maybe the result is an effort. But that's, of course, a very philosophical start, but you have to keep that in mind, and this is why I brought this table of the so I don't go, my schedule is I will first read a recent best effort clause, which you all should know by now, and then I will talk about the context briefly. That's almost Laurent's point. Then I will talk about the special contracting risks for the acquisition or the ordering of vaccines. I'm not talking about procurement, I'm talking about ordering. As you see, I'm in that sense a civil lawyer. Also, I've spent all my life on the borderline between public law and civil law. And then I will go to the details of the definition of reasonable best efforts in one of the APA contracts, and a second one, which is really idiotic in my view, the AstraZeneca case, which has also caused already a lot of turmoil and will go on causing turmoil because the contract is really, in my view, part of the problem. And I will talk about in more detail about the CureVac clause. Also, the vaccine is not yet existing. It's still to be finalized. It's in stage 3 at the moment, the CureVac thing. It's also something like the BioNTech and the Moderna vaccine. It's one of these modern vaccines. And then I will go into contract theory a little bit, because I think that will be more or less my point in terms of what did we learn or what can we learn from the crisis. And I think we have to try to get a better understanding of contract, not of contract law, which is basically a doctrinal thing, but of contract and the function of contract in that context. And I think that will also help in the discussion of the public contract regimes, because they may be a little bit too simple for coping with the problems which we have at the moment. And I'm saying that as a law and economics person who is in that field, studying contracts for 45 years now, 45, I'm reading contracts since 45 years and looking at them and studying one clause after the other. I can already say one of the things is if somebody talks about the best effort clause or the force majeure clause, that's something which doesn't exist. It's not, there is no such thing like a best effort clause or a force majeure clause, but there are, every contract has own best efforts clauses and force majeure clauses, and all clauses I'm talking about are different because they are adjusted to the necessities. If they are copied, in most cases, things go wrong. Okay, so I start my presentation by simply looking at the use of the best effort, the reasonable best effort clause in CureVac on the basis of this APA, Advanced Purchase Agreement. The contractor commits to use reasonable best efforts to obtain EU marketable authorization for the product and to establish sufficient manufacturing capacities to enable the manufacturing and supply of the contractual agreed volumes of the product to the participating member states in accordance with the estimated delivery schedule set out below in Article 111, once at least a conditional EU marketing authorization has been granted. That's the key, but I will also detail, because in the definitions you have a very large and very tricky definition of reasonable best efforts. So what's the problem? Context and preliminary analysis. If my students enter my class on international contracting, and that basically is a drafting course, how do you draft a contract? Usually I expose them to context and the preliminary analysis of what is needed for the purpose. And in our case, there was an urgent need, a very urgent need for research and development, because there was no such thing like a vaccine for COVID-19. Production and distribution of drugs for treatment and vaccination in the pandemic. And the analog is really the closest analog, and this is why one doesn't want to mention it. The Trump approach was probably the one I would have taken. The closest analogy is really defense contracting, because it's really a sort of war against something. It doesn't have much to do with the procurement of police uniforms or building of highways. You really have to be asked quickly, and you have to unite all forces to fight against this. I don't like these paradigms of fighting, but in that case, I think they are appropriate. The other thing is there was no original treaty competence of the EU, if you look a little bit closer. And the question is, how far does it reach if it is delegated to the EU? That was, of course, a very comfortable solution for Frau Merkel, because she could simply say, I'm at the moment in the presidency of the Rat, but I delegated to the EU. It was an enormous chance for the EU of doing something exciting, but my analysis that they basically failed. There was a presence of a plurality of competent private R&D production firms as potential contractors. And that led to the key task of setting up an institutional framework for an adequate contracting scheme that should be incentive compatible. That's at least my style of analysis. I'm looking what would work under the circumstances, what would be incentive compatible. And I don't care about, that's of course very rough now, I don't care for the distinction between public and private on that point. And for that purpose, you have to analyze the different phases. That's very important, of research, development, production, delivery, and the related structural diverse contracting topics. That's very important, because that's really the big failure of the contracts which were concluded by the EU as agent for the member states.
Erich?
Yes?
Erich, may I ask you if you can change the slides, because I think we are still...
I changed it. I changed them. Don't they change?
Okay, so apparently we only have the first slide.
I'm so sorry. No, they're changed on my screen. How can I operate that?
I think it's through your own PowerPoint presentation screen.
Okay, I go out.
Sorry for that.
No, it's very important. This is obviously I can't get out
yes.
of one.
Here we are.
Is it there? Okay.
Yes.
And they obviously don't accept the full screen. Okay.
Okay,
now,
I'm sorry for that. Thank you.
No. Why didn't you say it before? Because it's all on that paper. I just said it's important to distinguish between the various phases, between research, development, production, delivery, and the different contracting topics. That's my main point and main analysis. The first phase is more or less granting subsidies for incentivizing super fast R&D involving a multitude of private competent research actors. But, and I will explain that, you should separate research from development. And then you have to develop a general legal framework, likely not a technical law, but rather a set of model agreements for a multitude of future competitive production networks, including rules for the hedging of specific product and production risks, general policies regarding patents, quality, pricing, delivery, and renegotiating dispute settlement. And then you need, in addition, individual stipulations with terms and conditions and standard requirements, contracts for the production and delivery of available defined products, and the individual quality, quantity, and timing and pricing. So that's the main argument, is really towards these numbers 2 and 3, and I will follow that through. There are special risks which may sound odd to you. You have to hedge, as I'm now looking from the contractor's side to the matter, not from the state side or the EU side. A contractor is interested in hedging the drug admission risk, because he's obviously at risk. If they don't allow the drug which they have developed, you are lost. This is a potential trap. The second special risk is you have to hedge a qualified network production risk, because obviously all these vaccines depend on delivery structures which are very complex, from the bottles to the original products which are fed in and so forth. That's really extremely complex to keep these international networks working. And one of the mistakes was really thinking of these things internationally, or at least European, which is not the proper approach to the thing. I mean, because there are products coming from India, products coming from the United States, and from any place of the world, possibly India. A lot of things are coming from India, actually. So you have to think global if you think of the network production risk. And you also have to hedge the political risk, because politicians, and that's already happening, do lock rolling. That's very unfortunate, but you have to hedge that risk. So you are in a precarious situation. They don't have clear incentive structures concerning one single objective, money making, making profits. They have all kinds of interesting ideas, and they may do lock rolling, and so you have to hedge that as a contractor. Now the question is, in which context do best efforts clauses matter? And then you have to look, first look at the definitions of the CureVac clause. So that's an interesting one, and I've highlighted in red what is interesting about that clause. I mean, the other things are more or less, I mean, you find that, but it's of course specific. I mean, there's no such thing, as I said, as a reasonable best effort clause, but there are many, and this is very specific. And if you look at the definition, the interesting point is what I highlight in red is really acknowledging that that's best efforts, and then they define a reasonable degree of best efforts to accomplish a given task, acknowledging that such things as, without limitation, the complex and highly regulated nature of the product, the timely availability of raw materials, inventories, liquid fluid, funds, yields of process, the success of the necessary clinical trial programs to support safety and immunogenicity data for the product, the approval of the final product formulation, and then contractors' commitments to other purchase of the product. That's, of course, something which is totally overshooting, because it has nothing to do with reasonableness. But they inserted it, and obviously the EU was so stupid to buy that part of the contract. I mean, I was getting really aroused when I saw this included in the reasonableness limitation of a best effort clause. I've seen many best effort clauses, but that's normally not in a best effort clause. And obviously they had advisors which were not competent enough to see that they were cheated at that point. That's making me nervous. And of course, they are limiting that, are beyond the complete control of the contractor. But if you have contracted beforehand, you are out of the game. Now, this is, of course, I'm sorry, I have to go back. So in AstraZeneca, it's even worse, because that's a really a clause which is in my view, close to stupidity. They are defining everything, and they are really missing the mark by doing that. They talk about a good state and a good producer, and I find this ridiculous in a sense. I mean, bonus Familias formula is inappropriate in such a contract, and you wouldn't do it. But obviously, somebody came along with that contract. Again, the other side didn't understand the contract, signed it, and that was it. To clarify the point, in a standard best effort clause, the parties are required to use their best efforts for achieving a specified goal, limited by adverse, hopefully specified circumstances that would reasonably lead to a release from the primary obligation. That's the function of a best effort clause. But that is, of course, not met by defining the properties of the parties that say you have to be a good state or you have to be a good producer. That's ridiculous. Now we get back to the Kurwerk clause. That's the other contract which was published, or at least published in part. In the Kurwerk clause, you find excuses for every conceivable uncertainty which came to the mind of the draftspersons on the firm's side. Now, the question is for me, did the draftspersons act in favor of their commercial clients, or in which respect are they trapped in some conventional misunderstandings of contract theory and contract law? And I find it's both, because somebody who is really cleverly contracting tries to reach a contract which is workable. And these contracts are nearly not workable. And this is, for me, irritating if I'm looking at other contracts. And the question is, what would be an appropriate architecture of the relationship management? Is the APA packaging of fundamentally different contracting issues in a single performance contract advisable? What does the basic theory of contract law teach us concerning strict and best effort performances? These are the, and then I get into contract theory and the performance theory. I want to be short. Bindingness is a problem. And the question is, under what circumstances do we need a contract which is only addressing best efforts, and what are performance contracts in the sense that you really have to reach results? Now, I'm taking up the old French decision because it makes sense in a drafting context. You can use that, but you shouldn't use it for doctrinal purposes of distinguishing between the more or less idea of performance. Performance is performance, full stop. And it doesn't distinguish between these two elements, as René de Mook thought in 1928. As I say, modern French law has basically understood that the distinction doesn't make too much sense, that this is operating on a sliding scale. It's not a fundamental natural law distinction between the two. And I'm mentioning Gaius, who is operating with three points, stare, prestare, fazer, but I'm not going further at that point. It remains an important simple drafting consideration, but always considering that it's working on a sliding scale. I go on because I think the time is running. That was already done. Do you see my slides, by the way? Is that okay? Hello?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yes, it's okay. Thank you.
The question is, what are the key technologies of shifting or moving the performance frontier from a drafting perspective? You can, if you don't want to be obliged, you can always agree on best effort clauses. Doctors and lawyers like best effort clauses because they don't want to show results. And they were obviously instrumental behind the idea, which is allegedly part of the old Code Civil. But it was René de Mook's idea, actually, to distinguish between the two things in a fundamental way. So it's interesting that you can, of course, remove liabilities if you agree on a best effort clause, because you don't have to perform. So, of course, you can agree on a best effort clause if you develop an unknown vaccine. However, what you use for a delivery of a developed existing vaccine would probably force majeure clauses, which would limit the performance idea. As I say, force majeure clauses are not force majeure clauses as now defined in the new Code Civil, but they are a multitude of clauses. When I teach contract law, I usually have examples of 5 pages. That's a kind of average 2 pages, 5 pages, where you define the instance of force majeure. There are tricky clauses which you see from the very beginning that they're accepting certain things. In other instances, they may make sense. So force majeure clauses are really an area which has to be studied more closely for understanding the effect of them. And you can't really define them in very general terms. The effort was made in the Code Civil, but in my view, it's basically worthless. I mean, it's informing somebody who doesn't understand the matter very well, but it doesn't really have any bearing on the practice of international contracting. This is now, I developed a taxonomy also for my course. That's something which I'm happy that I could develop it in this context. There's a taxonomy of bindingness and enforcement. Letters of intent are non-binding technically, but they have certain binding functions. Best effort contracts are, of course, in the binding area, but they are reduced, the liability is reduced by reasonableness clauses. And performance contracts are usually limited by force majeure clauses. If you guarantee a performance, you nevertheless agree on hardship clauses. If you cannot really do it, you will also try to excuse yourself. So, but don't misunderstand this thing as a typology. It's on a sliding scale. I'm not saying best effort contracts, performance contracts, guarantee contracts are contract types which can be separated in practice. Sometimes they go from step to step. But in our case, you can find that the first step should have been a best effort contract to develop the vaccine, because that was an objective where the result was unclear. You simply had to exercise best efforts. The second instance, where you have a developed vaccine, should be a performance contract. And that was misunderstood in all APAs, which I saw at least. There were 4 APAs which I looked at. They are all not distinguishing between best effort contract and performance contract. Now, this means basically that we have to depackage the contract regime for idiosyncratic future tasks. For designing a matching contract regime, it's essential to discriminating between the various phases of the undertaking. In the COVID-19 vaccine case, it's obvious that the agreement had to be depackaged. The development process had to be started in terms of best efforts, limited by reasonableness. The modalities of production and deliveries had to be started in terms of execution, limited by force majeure. And the professional approach, even if you do it in one agreement, you have to distinguish clearly between a part A and a part B, and you have to condition part B on the existence, of course, of the vaccine. That means basically, if you want to understand best effort clauses, first, there is no the best effort clause. That's very important to understand that. Our analysis demonstrates that the best effort clauses have 2 phases, a technical and a strategic, depending on the practical context in which they are employed. If the key aspect of the performance contemplated by the parties is indeed an effort, they are the adequate technical institutional module for covering the detail of the deal and the basic calibration of the performance and liability regime. However, they may also serve as a strategic smokescreen device for shifting the balance of essential performance and liability aspects in favor of one party, reflecting either market power or inattentiveness, indifference, or incompetence of the counterpart. I mean, I assume that the EU has really entered into this strategic trap here. Maybe they put that trap up and the other side didn't understand it, because that's why they're currently talking about export vetoing and arm twisting procedures which in the international trade regimes. If the contract would have been properly drafted, these problems wouldn't be as prominent. I'm not saying that they didn't come up because there are distributional issues behind the contract, but I think this was really bad drafting. A final note on contract planning and negotiating strategy. In the negotiating process, it's obvious that the relevant private parties for development and procurement would opt for a package deal, an APA completely covered by best effort clause, and as many reasonable excuses as possible. They would also try to avoid a coordinated regime offered by the public counterpart in the form of a Part A, Part B model agreement. In the COVID contract case, miraculously, the private parties succeeded on both counts. This is not only about bargaining power, we ought to think hard about the intellectual causes. People are much too much stuck in their traditional ways of thinking. This is what Lawrence emphasized. We are stuck in these old forms of procurement contracting, and we are not understanding what's going on here. I humbly submit that I doubt whether a shift from the private to public contracting alone would remedy the failures within the institutional design of our case or within future legal challenges of this kind. In my view, it is rather a matter of a better understanding of contract theory and incentive-compatible institutional design. That's my final teaching here. And I, of course, come back to Heracles. You see, here is the god already with a lion, which he has caught, and he has already the apples, which are, of course, were the target. I mean, I should have used the apples, which Heracles actually procured by cheating Atlas. You may know the story that he cheated Atlas and got the apples, got away with the apples and brought them to the gods, and finally became a god because he collected the apples, but by cheating. Merci de votre attention. Merci.